Okay, welcome everyone. Today I have Jan Winhall, which I'm super excited for so many different reasons, but I'm reading from Jan's about on her website that I find this sentence quite inspiring. She'll tell us more about it as we go. That's Jan, I started my career as a social worker slash psychotherapist 40 years ago. I listened with non-pathologizing ears and heard shocking stories of sexual torture and responses that confused me. I love that sentence, Jan. Welcome first. So for many different reasons, because, you're a therapist, and seeing things that confused you, that must be quite an vulnerable place to be as a therapist, psychotherapist, and dealing with all these stories. So what confused you, if I may ask?
Well, that was a long time ago. I was just fresh out of graduate school. It was in early 80s. And what confused me was that I was surrounded by a theoretical framework that saw these young women that were in my group for incest survivors as having borderline personality disorder and being, they pathologized them. And not only that, but these women were really treated with contempt. That their behaviors of self-harming behaviors were seen through a lens of manipulation and attention seeking, and really very disrespectful to who I grew to understand these young women to be and what their behaviors were really about. So through a feminist lens back then, that's how I really began to deconstruct the kind of traditional, and I would say still very current in many ways, paradigm of misogyny, of really seeing these women as just, dismissing them as acting out and just being obnoxious and go away.
Yeah, and they're, even though that they're the victims in the scenario, it's the blame is put on them, and they kind of caused it or
yes,
it by the way they acted or whatever the story is.
that part of it was never said explicitly in the hospital setting.
Yeah,
but it was implied. It was implied, and it was actually Judith Herman's work. I don't know if you know Judith Herman's work, Trauma and Recovery, but it's a magnificent book, and it came out in the 90s, and we were all very excited about it. And we just gobbled it up when it came out. We read it like crazy. And Judith Herman, I reread more recently when I was writing my book. And I realized that, she understood those behaviors through the lens of the nervous system. And while we didn't have that language of the autonomic nervous system like we have now when we talk about polyvagal theory now, we talked about it in terms of the sympathetic response of flooding. We called it flooding. And the numbing, that shutting down dorsal response that Steve Porges has named, we called numbing. So we just talked about how there was so much dysregulation in the body around numbing and flooding. And we saw those behaviors. That's what confused me, was how could something, it was a paradox. How could something that hurts you also on some level be described by these women as helping them? So with substance abuse, it's a little more obvious, right? It's like, you're stressed in your system. You come home, you drink a bottle of wine, you shift from that sympathetic response into shutting down into dorsal. We get that. But what's trickier is, cutting the body, for example, which a lot of these women were doing. or acting out sexually, like going into environments that were really unsafe sexually. And why would somebody do that? So you can say it's masochistic, but when I listened, that's not what came through at all. It was more a sense of something about that behavior they knew helped them.
Yeah.
They knew that in their bodies, they knew that, right?
Yeah.
But they didn't understand it conceptually, and neither did I. So that's what was confusing. It was that how can something help you and harm you at the same time?
Yeah. The reason I'm really excited to speak with you, although I'm not a therapist and I don't have that direct experience of knowledge about, addiction, but your model in treating addiction and trauma is using the felt sense, the polyvagal informed felt sense. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly. So this is like music to my ears, with the felt sense of the polyvagal. And then when you talk about your conceptual work, there's the interpersonal neurobiology,
Yes.
which are all things that really I did not study the felt sense, but it's a word that I've heard a lot and I've used in a lot of somatic
Yes.
practices that I have, and that's where I come from. So those are the words that, like, I don't deal with trauma, but in a somatic awareness of
Yes.
expression and embodied coaching. That's what.
Yes.
So these words kind of like, oh wow, this is this is super cool that to have all of these things. And if you could take me to further know your framework and the theories behind it.
Yeah, well, it's a model that, it just developed for me over 40 years of practice of finding different ways of helping and then finding the commonality in those ways. So the first way that I found was through focusing and working with the felt sense, because I could see that what was that something about change, what was helping these women shift in their bodies, I needed to pay more attention to. And so, and then this was part of feminist therapy back then as well, was much more paying attention to somatics. And so that's where I started the journey. And I found a wonderful and incredible teacher in Canada, Mary Armstrong, who was teaching focusing and felt sensing. And then her teacher was actually Jean Gendlin, who created the words felt sense.
Yeah.
And so I studied under Jean Gendlin, the master, for over 30 years. Okay. And that was such a gift. I mean, just incredible gift. Gendlin was a real genius, and he was a student of Carl Rogers in the States. And so they understood that change happens in the body.
Yes.
We live in the body. We've forgotten that.
Can you give us a little bit of insight on what focusing is? Because I know a lot of people, maybe they know the practice, but they don't know that the framework or the modality and the word focusing.
Yes, I think the words felt sense are becoming much more common in the language now. But what I find is that people don't actually really know what Gendlin meant by the felt sense. They think it's sensations.
Yes, body sensation. I used to think about, that's what I used to think until I read your explanation about it. And that's actually 4 things. And that really made sense.
So understanding those avenues into the felt sense, that the felt sense is really, it's the way that our bodies speak to us. So in a very simple way, we can find our way into that through thoughts and feelings and physical sensations in the body, and also memories, right? Like how I'm experiencing you right now in my body. So if we pause and just notice, right? So for me, there's often this kind of sensation in my upper chest of a kind of it often comes like this, as a kind of a billowy cloud.
Yeah.
And that's the place where I feel the excitement and the joy about teaching this stuff, because the world needs this. If we all connected to our bodies, and it's a state of integration. It's like, this is where interpersonal neurobiology also comes in around. It's the integration of all of those different aspects of experiencing.
Yeah.
And when trauma comes, we split them off.
Yeah.
So I may not know how I feel in my body. I may be completely disconnected from my body, or I may feel into my body, but I don't have any thoughts about what's happening. I've gone into a more, that kind of a dissociated state. So that's very helpful when you're working with people, particularly around trauma and addiction, because then you can see where they're present and where they're really disconnecting and not integrated into experiencing. And so the body tells us things, right? And right now, for example, while I'm also really enjoying this whole felt sense of excitement and joy and being with you and sharing this information, there's also, I'm noticing like a kind of a tightness in my shoulder. Now, I could say, oh, that's because I've been working on my computer. And, sometimes it is.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is. It might be today, but if I was to quiet myself and to drop down into my body, and especially if I had a focusing partner to do that with, so we partner in focusing a lot. And that's the piece around relating and co-regulating with each other in our bodies. So if I was to do that, I could tell you a little more about that I know, that isn't about my stiff neck with my computer. It's about some of the stress involved with what I'm doing right now.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a little opening there where the body's saying, oh, pay attention to this. And, in Western culture, I would say, either I would just say, oh, I've got a stiff neck, or I would get mad at myself, like, suck it up.
Yeah.
Because we've just really forgotten we live in our bodies. We're so emphasizing cognition. You see that in all these therapies that are around, and I think they're wonderful, but not if you bypass the body, you've left the most important piece behind.
Yeah.
Because the body will trump us every time, eventually.
The body will win, and then it's for many people, when you start talking body, it's just the physical thing. So a stiff neck, then it's the muscles, and it becomes too technical about the body is a thing. It's like a machine, something.
Yes,
or
exactly.
It's not, even though that it's not. And I think for me, that was the realization, is like, yes, because thoughts and memories and feelings also have a body sensation, and sometimes it's unexplainable. And I think that's it. I don't know. Can you describe to someone what a felt sense is?
A felt sense is like, and a felt shift. This is important too in the body. So the beginnings of a felt sense might feel like you wake up in the morning and you're going to go work out at the gym, but you have this queasy feeling in your tummy, and something just doesn't feel right. So you phone your friend and you go have a coffee instead. And your friend listens to you with compassion, with non-pathologizing ears. And you slow down and you bring attention into your stomach with compassion, no judgment, just being curious about what's going on in there. And your friend might ask a question or two, like, what's going on in your life these days? Or when did you first notice you had this, upset stomach? And you're quiet and you listen to your body. And somehow you get back to, that conversation I had with my boss, on Thursday. And then your friend supports you in going a little deeper in there. And then a lot of stuff starts to come, right? And sometimes you might have a good cry. And then you feel better. You go, oh, yeah, that's what it was. And then by listening to the body, there's a felt shift. It's like, then you realize, my God, my stomach doesn't hurt anymore. I feel much better. And I know what I need to do. I need to get back to my boss about that comment that he made, because that didn't feel good. Mm-hmm. It's like that. It's a process of really paying attention to the wisdom in the body.
Yeah. The
problem, of course, is that when we get stuck in these trauma feedback loops in the nervous system, flight, fight, and then freeze, and then folding down into dorsal, we lose connection with that state of integration and felt sense. And then we go around and around, and the body gets locked into these trauma feedback loops. And that's not a wise place. No, so that's where top-down stuff is really helpful, is to be able to, and in my model, I made a graphic version of the model. So you can actually look at it and see where you are in your nervous system, and then understand, okay, I'm in these threatened, dysregulated states. I need to go back to my practice, back into my body, back into developing these new neural pathways that help me to get back into a ventral state in the nervous system, to breathe and to feel grounded again, and to feel that shift after focusing, and then you get back on track again. Yeah. And there's lots of different practices. I mean, there's many different things you can do to bring in that ventral state, like playing the piano and visiting friends and all of those things. But what I really synthesized in the model were these two basic embodied processes. One is an interoceptive process of felt sensing, and the other is a neuroceptive process, as Steve Porges names it, of noticing how the body is checking constantly for, am I safe, am I not safe, and then helping us shift into those states of defense if we need them.
Yeah, the graphs are beautiful. It's really very pleasant to look at.
Yes, I tried to make them like that because they appeal to the body, right? It feels
and anyone
good.
Who's listening, you could go to Jen's website and subscribe, and you'll be sent those visuals. Really nice. And
there's lots of material. JenWinhall.com. If you sign up to my newsletter, you can get all of those. The body cards we also use. Did you ever look at those?
Yes. Yeah.
You can draw the felt sense in your stomach on a body card with different colors and shapes and whatever. And then there's a place on the body card to also describe the thoughts and the feelings, the physical sensations, and the memories that the body carries. And particularly then you can use these practices for like grounding. So we could spend an hour together listening to each other around a safe space grounding practice. Right? And then make a body card, and then you can use that as a way of resourcing.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, I'm just listening to your voice as you were speaking and slowing down, even though I'm not going through a process, because I'm paying attention to what you're saying. I feel my body's going.
Yeah.
And it's slowing down. And I think that's the key to it. It's the slow down, which I think that brings us into the loop, which from what little I know to addiction, is slowing down when things are really painful. Slowing down is no, you don't want to go there. On the contrary, the body, in the body's wisdom, doing everything else
to avoid that, to avoid presence. Yeah.
And I think that's one of beautifully put, unpathologizing addiction. And that's what a wonderful way to deal with it.
Yeah, because then you really see what I believe are the true functions of addiction, which is to facilitate, I call them like propellers. They facilitate state shifts in the nervous system. So they shift you back and forth. And you can see it particularly with something like cutting. This was confusing too, because women would cut, but it would be, or men, but in my group, either to shift into dorsal to numb because the body excretes these endogenous opioids.
Yes.
So when you do something that hurts you, there's a protective feature that comes, right? Bessel van der Kolk did some studies around this too. Fascinating stuff. So it makes sense that if you go back and repeat how you were wounded, there's two things that happen. One, you are telling the story of what happened to you through your body, say through acting out sexually in a dangerous environment. You also are taking your body back to a state where it will secrete these endogenous opioids, which brings relief. It shuts you down into dorsal, and most people would then describe how they would fall asleep after. So they would get relief. Yeah. And that's how bodies protect us, right?
And with that current, I think, worldwide model and, treatment to addiction is, okay, let's remove that thing out. Stop the cutting or stop the whatever, like it becomes a more of a will of like, no, you need to stop that, as it, what Steve would say, intentionality, like, okay, so this is a conscious decision and you can consciously just stop.
Right. But you can't. It's not a conscious decision. I think it's an instinct for survival. It's in us to do that. We don't think about, oh, gee, I think I'll go back to where I was sexually assaulted and do it again. No. The body takes us to these places that need attention, but also have helped us through numbing, for example. So yeah, when I read about then polyvagal theory, it was like, okay, now this really makes sense. And then I met Steve in 2018 at the United States Association of Body Psychotherapies conference, wonderful organization. And we talked, and then it just was like, yes, he said, I've always seen addictions as state regulation strategies. Yeah. So I showed him my model and he said, yes, this all makes sense. And then I wrote a book. And then I wrote an article with him in the USABP journal, which would be great for your viewers to read, because it really lays it out very well. He starts with the neurobiology piece of it, and then I do the model and give an example, a case example.
Yeah, I read that. It's quite, and I say this, it's easy to follow, but I don't know. I'm saying because I've been reading all of this for a while, but I feel it's quite accessible.
I think
to
so.
read. And I think that's the same thing of even a lot of things, with children behavior, adolescents, teenager, to view whether it's addiction or anything, or behavior, because behavior can be an addiction, it is an attempt to regulate our state.
Yeah. So particularly with kids, you'll see that, right? Especially if they're like acting out, we can say, oh, they're being bad, but what's happening is their little bodies are going into flight or fight because they don't feel safe, right? It all comes back to that. And what is safety? That's a huge question. What is safety for any of us right now with COVID and whatever's going on in climate change? But what is safety for marginalized people? What is safety for queer people or trans people? Can't come from outside of us. So
No.
we have to find these ways of finding some measure of safety inside ourselves and together where we can feel that and co-regulate. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Ah,
Mhm.
that is, I have two things that I know the least about in your model, and that's the feminist trauma-informed theory, which I think you talked about. I think it's Judith Herman,
Yes.
who talked about that. Can you say a little bit more about that for
Yeah.
myself and the viewer?
Yeah. So, back 40 years ago, it was a very exciting time um, in Toronto and all over North America, really, around developing feminist therapy and really understanding the hierarchical nature and the pathologizing nature in which women were being treated in the system. And, that the whole system was really designed by men. And really saw women as kind of hysterical in a lot of ways. And certainly in the psychiatric hospitals, this is absolutely was what we saw. And so we really started to articulate more non-hierarchical models of being with other human beings and helping them to heal.
Yeah.
And really also talking a lot about safety. Like another big person for me was Sandra Butler, Judith Herm, they're both still alive. Sandra Butler wrote the first book on incest, The Conspiracy of Silence. Remarkable book. And she came to Toronto, which is where I am. And it was incredible. She said, when you see a woman acting in these ways that are driving you crazy, because there's no question that some of those ways can drive us crazy, she is simply showing you what she learned to do to survive. Now that is polyvagal theory. And that's what I learned 40 years ago. So with a different language.
Yeah.
So how do you co-regulate when you're so busy sitting behind a desk and being Dr. So-and-so? You don't. We're just all people. Drop the doctor, please. I don't use the DSM at all. I've never liked it. I think it doesn't really answer. It disembodies people. It bypasses the body, except understanding the body as kind of machine-like, right?
Yeah.
So the most powerful way that I found to really understand a range of suffering, but also of just a behavior, of joy, of experiencing, is through the autonomic nervous system. Because and through introception, through how we psychologically experience life and make sense out of life and make meaning out of our lives. So that brings me to the felt sense of introception and neuroception, or the neurophysiology of understanding how our bodies respond depending on how safe we feel, which is really a key feature of polyvagal theory, right? Is this Steve's notion of the intervening variable, which I had no idea what he meant by that, but now I do. I totally get it. And once you get it, you never forget it, right? It's like
After reading it for the 100th time.
Yeah, the intervening variable is the nervous system. It's like there's a behavior and then there's a response. That's the typical behaviorism that people learn in psychology.
Yeah.
And what he's saying is there's an intervening variable between the stimulus and the response. And that's how safe you feel in your body and what state you are currently in. Yeah. So, if I'm walking down the street and I'm in a pretty good sweet spot and I feel pretty ventral, grounded in my body, and somebody bumps into me, it's like, oh, no sweat, don't worry about it, and off we go. If I'm in fight and I walk down the street and somebody bumps into me, I want to punch them.
Absolutely. Yes.
It's a totally different response, right?
It's almost having different, I say I have three different people
Yeah,
in so many different ways, one in ventral, one in sympathetic, one in dorsal.
but that's
They,
very true. And you're bringing up an important point that the model is just a basic model of how bodies work. So you can bring it into any different kind of therapy you're doing. You can also, I mean, in the classes that I teach, I have a certification course on the Polyvagal Institute website. I have coaches, I have somatic educators, I have people that are in organizations, executive coaches that are trying to work with people to help them to change the way their whole organization is developed, naturopaths. So it's a model that it really just helps you to bring the body back into whatever it is that you're doing and working with.
Absolutely. And I think what kind of attracted me and kind of makes me want to be part of spreading the polyvagal theory and is that first is it de-shaming. It's not I'm not doing this because I'm a bad person or all the lists that we put on ourselves. And the second thing that I felt like, yeah, this actually describes my experience.
Yes,
This is how, it's the very classical kind of kids, mom, you start, yes, and you respond in ventral, then you start getting all annoyed. And then just you get up and go to a different room. And that's going through that. So there is almost a felt sense of like, yeah, this is what I'm feeling.
yeah.
And this
That's
word,
right.
these words describing how I'm feeling. It's not like other models where I feel that I have to sort of bring myself to fit this model.
Exactly.
It's describing a human condition, and it's leveling the playing field, because if you're talking about a nervous system, it doesn't matter from where, what happened, how rich, how poor, what's the socioeconomic and the social level. It doesn't matter. It's
all live in our bodies.
We're all in our bodies. A question that comes up in my mind in many people's, I don't know if you have an answer or question that is there a difference in the nervous system between men and women? Do women adapt or shape the nervous system differently? And I'm talking in a really general sense here. But are there any differences in
do you
how
mean
they're wired?
Do you mean in how our nervous system becomes shaped?
Yes.
Based on, oh God, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in at least in North American culture, again, this takes us back to feminist theory as well, through a feminist lens. In fact, I want to do I do live Zoom meetups once a month, and I want to do a meetup with the Polyvagal group, where we have a group on trauma and addiction. It's free. Everybody should come to this. It's through Mighty Networks. It's on my website. You can join and come to them. But I'm trying to organize one where we talk about this through polyvagal theory through a feminist lens.
Okay.
So yes, because what happens for women is that we're socialized to go into appeasement.
Yes.
To please, right? That's where we're socialized. And for men, I think they're socialized much more to go to fight, to not show vulnerability. And I mean, our nervous systems are shaped by the culture that we live in big time.
Yeah, and I think it's generally also the same of appeasement, of putting a smile and kind of, even there are proverbs in Arabic that it's coming to my mind is that describes that. It's like, okay, you're fine, you're good, but let's not
to be subservient to an oppressor in order to stay safe.
And that's why a lot of women, I think, I can't say, but in a lot of places stay in marriages because of that, and it's kind of ripples. And I don't know if appeasement shows up in a good way at all.
Well, this is really interesting, and Steve's very interested in this, and I love the way, bless his heart, the
Yeah.
way that he frames it, in terms of really seeing the adaptive features of of appeasement, is that we are actually co-regulating with the oppressor in a sense, because it's adaptive in order to stay alive or to stay in a relationship where we are safe, or at least. Yeah. Yeah. So, and I often would joke about how I grew up like that with my mother, not a father, but my mother, who I appeased. And I would joke about how, well, there's a lot of characteristics in appeasement that are really good in being a therapist. So, I mean, the downside is, I think, to be a good therapist, you have to also really know how to sometimes be tough and challenge. And that's harder when you're locked in appeasement. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think also with and I love Deb Dana's work with this, is nothing is bad. There's no state or even a conditioning or adaptive response that it's inherently bad. It's something that we have developed to do. And at some point for me, I see it like, okay, the difference is, okay, I have a choice now. And sometimes I'm not in a mood to fight. I'm just going to appease and let this
Yeah. Let this slide along. Yeah.
well, just gonna, I can't be bothered with that. And even with dorsal and sympathetic, it's there isn't any. Again, I go back to shame of doing it. It's about having, being. I feel it's empowering. It's like, okay, so this is what my body is telling me.
Yeah,
And
bodies just do it.
And I did an interview with Steve, and I was joking that I think like 50% of arguments would cease to exist if people didn't start talking when they're hungry.
Hungry,
Just
angry, lonely. That's a 12-step thing too, which I really actually like that. HALT. Are you familiar with that?
no.
Yeah. Hungry, it's HALT. They say hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Not that's a precursor for addiction, right?
Oh, is it? I didn't know, but I know if I'm really hungry and someone is talking to me, I have no patience, no capacity to.
This word they also say hangry, which means
Angry, yeah.
hungry and angry. Yeah. Well, and I love thinking about this. I actually wrote a chapter in my book about the felt sense polyvagal dialogue. And in this, I brought in actually Harville Hendricks and Helen LaKelly Hunt's work in imago therapy. I don't know if you're familiar, but it's wonderful work. And in this way that we work with the model, both parties, or all in the whole family even, but that gets really complex, but it's also teaching your kids how to use that 6F graphic model of where they are in the nervous system, because typically people will opposites attract, and they'll, somebody that lives more in dorsal will couple with somebody, even in friendships or whatever, who lives more in sympathetic, and then they drive each other crazy in this kind of power struggle, rather than understanding that how those opposite responses can come together and provide some waking up or calming down that each person is looking for really in their body. Like dorsal needs some sympathetic to wake up, and sympathetic needs some dorsal to slow down. And so it's a wonderful way of working with people. Yeah.
It's it is. And again, when I know, oh, my partner is in dorsal or in sympathetic, it's like, okay. And even that awareness of it puts kind of a halt to the story,
Yeah.
That is kind of formulating. It's like, oh, they're ignoring me, they're not talking to me, they're blah blah blah, but they are in dorsal. And once we have this language that it's I remember one time I was feeling this sympathetic kind of energy, and I didn't have an incident or something that I can blame it on, but it was happening. And I was like, I'm thinking, my house, my husband and my kids, like, I feel like I'm agitated. It's not because of you guys. You didn't do anything, but I have this, and I'm just gonna hopefully go to sleep and get it over with. But that awareness of it,
Yeah.
my body's doing something, and my body wants to go on dorsal, and respecting the body, and which is but I think that understanding of what is happening and having the felt sense of it. I had a question about being disconnected, and hopefully it would come back. But I think I think this embodiment is a kind of a global thing that we don't feel our body and what we're doing. How do you see it in your field, and also in respect to therapy and psychotherapy? Do you see it edging towards hopefully reaching the threshold where it could make a big difference in how therapy and addiction, since we're talking about it, is viewed from your point?
You mean bringing in more embodiment, whether we're having an impact? Yes, I think we are. I mean, if I look back to the whole field of trauma and addiction, but particularly trauma over 4 decades, it's not comparable. I mean, back then, very few people talked about trauma, very few. And now it's everywhere in our work. Trauma informed everything is really becoming more and more and more the case, which is wonderful. In addiction, it's coming. It's still pretty, these two areas really developed separately. It's quite a shame, but they did. So there's most of the ways that we understand and treat addiction are based on seeing it as a brain disease. Although I've never understood, I've never been able to get an answer from somebody on how you can have a brain disease and then just stop cold turkey and everything's fine and you don't have a disease anymore. How does that work? Like you no other disease is like that. I mean, anyway, I think we're starting, Gabor Mate has become so big now since I met him 4 years ago. But really bringing those two fields together, that trauma and addiction are one side, two sides of the same coin. And so I think it is getting better. Yeah, it's very hopeful, I think, over time. Also, the decade with the brain in the 90s and understanding more about neuroplasticity and how brains really develop. And then brought in Mark Lewis's model, learning model of addiction to help us.
That was my next question. Yes.
Yeah.
Can you explain that, or give us a brief?
Yeah. So Mark is a friend. He lives in Toronto, and we've had great conversations. Again, there's a free interview that I did with Mark on the Polyvagal Institute website, and he was actually until he was around 30, he was a heroin addict, and then he became a neuroscientist. So he wrote this amazing book called Memoirs of an Addicted Brain that looks at addiction through his own experiencing. He tells the sort of a memoir story, but he also tells the story of what's happening in the brain. And he never bought the idea that it was a brain disease. He really looked at how neuroplasticity works and how addiction is really a behavior that is repeated over and over and over again, like a habit is formed. It's learned in the brain through neural pathways, but it becomes an extremely bad habit. It's like the same neurons that fire together, wire together, and build these pathways. So from a polyvagal perspective, you see that addictive behaviors are shifting us from that sympathetic state of threat down into the dorsal state of shutting down and back again. And they form this pathway that becomes rigid. It's called the plastic paradox. It's like, yeah, brains change. We know that now through fMRIs and whatever. But they also develop rigid pathways if you walk down the same pathway over and over and over again. And that becomes a habit. And then, of course, it's not to minimize it by saying it's a bad habit, but to describe it that it works the same way in the brain as a habit. It's learned. And the way that I find of really understanding this clearly when I read what he wrote about this is like it's the same state. The brain looks exactly the same in the state of infatuation as it does in addiction, which is really interesting. But we can all relate to that, right? Like, when you're falling in love and like you can't wait to see the person again, or your phone goes off and you get a little flutter in your heart and you keep thinking about them. That feeling of keeping on thinking about them and wanting to go back and fantasizing and whatever, euphoric recall, it's the same state that appears in the brain in addiction.
Yeah.
So
are there any quote unquote good addiction? Because someone would say, it's a habit. It's something I'm addicted to. But I'm okay. Is there such a thing as a good addiction?
The way that I define addiction is really simple. It just comes from the women that I worked with. It's something that it helps you in the short term and it hurts you in the long term, and you can't stop doing it.
Okay. That's very beautiful, very simple.
Real simple.
It really
it
answers
through all of those things about, am I an addict? I'm not an addict. Oh, I just like sex. You're uptight, blah, blah. It's cut through. It's like, if it's not bothering you and it doesn't have a downside, then okay.
It doesn't hurt in the long term, then go, because that's sometimes the reason I ask that is that sometimes there's like, it's something that you do all the time. It makes me feel better. But if something is making me feel better and I can continue doing it, why do I need to stop it? It's helping me regulate. It might look differently to other people, but if there's no harm in the long term, then
it's great.
Who to say that you shouldn't be doing this or that?
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. It's I think it's really humanizing human, if that's a thing.
Yes, it does. It just helps us to really understand Steve would say that, right? It really shows us what it means to be human. This is just, and addictions are just how bodies work. They're just like instinctual survival strategies. And so, we need to understand that about the body. That's just how bodies work. They will go to whatever it takes to survive. So if you're a little kid and you're being abused, going to the fridge and filling up with food to be able to numb yourself is a really good strategy if you can't get out of there. Or masturbating is a huge one that, we have so much shame in our culture around sex. And yet I'm very concerned about, we do a lot of work used to in sex addiction, and want to keep really teaching and working in this area, because the pornography industry is the most lucrative industry in the world, and we have serious problems going on here. Serious problems. So we have to be able to talk about sex and masturbating and pleasure, and when is it a problem and when isn't a problem. Often there are debates about that around sex addiction, right? Oh, I'm just doing this thing and you have a problem with it because you're uptight. Right? Yeah. So it's a big area that needs work.
And brings me to sometimes I'm asked this question about, you earlier you talked about this kind of feeling in the stomach or that kind of thing, because that sometimes it comes from anxiety and feeling like, oh, I can't be doing this, or some people talk about stage fright too. It's like, how is that different from my intuition, for example? And I tell them I don't have it. There's, I wonder if you have an answer to that. I don't have an answer because it feels very different, and I know when I'm feeling.
I think you're talking about that distinction between a neurophysiological response of sympathetic anxiety, the flight place in the nervous system. And then there's our experiencing of what's going on there, the felt sense of that.
Yes.
What meaning does this response carry for me? And that's where the meaning comes from, sitting with, paying attention to that feeling and being curious about it, and doing that in partnerships where we feel safe with each other, we could socially engage. And it's through, Jen would say, if you can stay with anything, it will open eventually. And as it opens, your body will show you what it's all about. And then there is this kind of shift that occurs in the body. It's a physical release, which I believe is a release in the nervous system. And so the felt shift for me, what I brought together was the felt shift of that release back to ventral. Is the process of helping that along comes through focusing, paying attention, welcoming whatever comes, all of what is there. Even the most uncomfortable things give us the most information about how we're living our lives. That's what Jean taught me.
Yeah, well, wonderful. If we have, and it's precious that focusing partner or another nervous system, or as Steve would say, appropriate species of another person. And that's where the relational part is so important. And sometimes I've seen it in the therapy world, other than the marriage and family counseling. But when someone is just dealing one-on-one, the relational part is kind of almost is not there. And I'm noticing we're coming to the end of our time, and I really enjoyed it, and probably have more questions in my head if I sit with it. But what is your kind of not learning edge that you're curious about? You want to find out more what is going on here that would expand your, whether it's your model or the understanding of the nervous system and this whole link to addiction.
There are often things that come up that are, we're because it's so new, we're not sure. So one of those things is this idea around blended states, and how we live, like, there's this kind of idea that, say, in the state of it, that addictions are static, or states are static, that they're one follows another. And I see these little glimmers when I'm working with people that are clearly in a kind of dorsal addictive state, in that loop. But there'll be these little moments where you can feel the ventral energy. And I'm curious about that, just about how different blended states, and people are making up different ones. Like, I've made up one called Fired Up that's in my model, because it's what I feel so much these days. Like right now, right? I feel ventral and it's good, but I'm also excited in bringing this in, so there's sympathetic in there too. So I guess it's just, how does the nervous system really work, right? Like, and people would ask me, can you be in two states at the same time? Well, several years ago we were like, no, I don't know. I mean, and now it seems more and more as though, they shift back and forth in that fixate state in my model very kind of rapidly often, right? So watching the body and the different states is fascinating.
It is, and with IFS, internal family,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
I think that to me that felt, it made sense because
Yeah.
different parts kind of have a different nervous system
Yeah.
of
No,
them, and
absolutely they do. It's a wonderful way of understanding parts. Yeah.
and because sometimes part of me is in dorsal, I feel like, but there's this kind of excitement of want to be out there and doing it, so it's
Yeah.
we're quite very complex in how our nervous system works. But I think I love the way you said it. It's like we pay attention and notice to our body, and that's where the wisdom is. Which that was my first, the question that was out is a lot of people don't get that the body has a wisdom, that all wisdom is a cognitive, analytical wisdom, and we lost so much from that.
Yeah.
So
That's a tragedy.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much. Jane. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope I did not read your book yet. I will get it and read it because there's a lot of juicy bits I've found in myself while you're speaking.
I'm writing a self-help workbook with my
Oh,
book.
okay.
I'm very excited about that. So
Well, we'll see that when it
okay.
happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Enjoy
so
the rest of
much.
your day.
You too. Bye bye.